Storage options for EC2 instances. Hey everyone, Ben Finkel here, and in this nugget, we're going to look over the basic storage options for our EC2 instances, specifically the root volume configuration storage. So we need to know where we're going to store our root volume, and that can happen in one of two places, either instance-backed or EBS-backed. We'll talk about each of those and compare and contrast them so you understand what they each mean. And then we'll finish up by looking at the life cycle of an EC2 instance, specifically with how that regards to storage and what happens to our root volume as a machine moves through its life cycle. When you first start up an EC2 instance, one of the most fundamental things that you're going to have to choose is what sort of storage do you want, specifically storage for what we call the root volume configuration. Now, you're going to have storage attached to your instance, and those are going to be stored in something called Elastic Block Store. Those will be your typical volumes that you will mount. But even before you get there, before you're attaching hard drives to your computer, you got to choose effectively where is the operating system installed. This is the root volume, and it's called SDA in your Linux instances. Typically it's SDA. C:\/ in your Windows instances, right? We call this the root volume, and you can store this root volume in one of two different ways with EC2 instances. These two different choices are chosen when you choose your AMI, your image. And the first type, the one that you're probably going to use less often, is called instance store backed. And what we mean by instance store backed is that that root volume is actually a physical drive that's connected to the host computer that is hosting your virtual machine image. So you've got direct access to a physical drive that is connected directly to that host machine. You're going to have exceptionally low I/O latency when you use an instance store backed machine. And that's compared to your other drives, which I mentioned will be out in Elastic Block Store. That's what I've got over here. We'll talk about Elastic Block Store in another nugget. But you know, your D:, your SDB, etc., those are going to be out here in Elastic Block Store. Those volumes will be out there. You'll still be able to connect to them, but they're not going to have exactly the same performance that this drive inside of your instance store is going to have. Now, the big downside to using Instance Store, obviously that sounds great, but the big downside is that this drive is ephemeral. And ephemeral is a funny vocab word, but it means short-lived. It doesn't last very long. And the simple fact of the matter is when you stop this instance, that drive disappears. It evaporates, and it gets recreated when you restart the instance. So data stored in that drive is not persistent. It doesn't stick around very long. If you're cognizant of that fact, you can use these for like immutable hardware. You can stand up and shut down instances that don't ever change their configuration during their life cycle or during their lifetime. Now, conversely, compared to instance store backed, you're probably more likely to use what we call EBS backed. And yeah, just like it sounds like, in EBS backed, we've taken the root volume, moved it out of that host machine, and we've put it into Elastic Block Store. So now, along with all of your other drives, all of your other volumes, the root volume is in EBS as well. And that means, yeah, you've got to load data from EBS back and forth each time. You're going to lose a little bit of performance, but what you're going to gain is you're going to gain persistence. So EBS volumes can actually persist beyond the lifetime of this machine. If you shut down or terminate this EC2 instance, well, that volume might still be out there. You can tell it to keep that volume, although it's important to note by default the behavior is to delete that volume, but you can certainly override that, flag it to keep, and as long as you keep that volume, you can always reattach it or use it to spin up another machine. So that volume and the data on that volume can persist beyond the lifetime, beyond the life cycle of the EC2 instance. And I think this is the type of machine that you're going to run into much, much more. Now, choosing this is really, really easy to do. I'm just going to bring up the dashboard here. So you can see that when you go to launch an instance, and by the way, you should have recognized this from our demo on the dashboard. Oops, that's too far. I'm going to go back here. When you are launching an instance and selecting your AMI, look at down here, root device type EBS. So this is going to tell you on every image that you choose what the root device type is. And that is going to lock you into that root device type. It's not like you can switch from instance store back to EBS while the machine is running or after you've spun it up. Your image is going to define that. And if we come down here to the AWS Marketplace, or maybe the community AMIs. Yeah, community, I can choose EBS root device type or instance store root device type. And that's going to limit me. That's going to filter out my images to those particular root device types. So here's a bunch of instance store root device types. Typically, again, I think you're going to end up using the EBS store because they give you the most flexibility and the most power, and frankly, that performance difference is not all that much. I would highly recommend you stick to EBS-backed instances. If we want to briefly take a high-level overview of instance store backed versus EBS-backed, well, EBS-backed have a much lower boot time, typically less than a minute versus instance store backed. And I know I indicated the instance store had a higher performance, but that's only for IOPS against the root volume because it is that local hard drive connected to that machine. For booting purposes, EBS back can start up once it's got a handle to that volume in EBS, whereas the instance store back has got to commission all of the hardware inside of the rack that's connected to that host machine in that specific data center, and that's going to cause it to take a little bit more time. You've also got a much higher size limit on EBS backed versus instance store backed. So because instance store backed is in that host machine in that data center and it's shared with all of the other tenants who are using that hardware, it limits you to 10 gigabytes on that root volume, whereas an EBS volume can be all the way up to 16 terabytes without any issue. Data persistence, like I talked about, data can persist beyond the lifetime of the machine with EBS backed. By default, that root volume is deleted when the instance terminates, but you can change a flag and tell it to not delete that root volume and persist that root volume after you terminate the instance. Charges are a little bit different. You're going to pay for EBS storage, EBS volume usage when you use an EBS-backed Amazon machine, whereas an instance-backed machine, you're only going to be charged for the instance usage and for storing your AMI in Amazon S3 if you've got a custom AMI. Then the last thing, this is really, really important. We're going to talk about this momentarily for the life cycle of the machines. EBS-backed can be stopped, whereas instance store-backed cannot be stopped. So instance store-backed machines can only be terminated. They terminate, the volume evaporates, it's ephemeral, it's gone. EBS-backed can be stopped, and importantly, this doesn't indicate it here, but their configuration can be changed. So while a machine is in a stopped state, while an EC2 machine is in a stopped state, you can make configuration changes to that machine type, to the size of the memory, the CPU, etc. That allows you a whole bunch of flexibility that you wouldn't otherwise have with an instance store backed. So let's finish up by taking a look at the life cycle of an EC2 machine, and specifically the life cycle as it relates to this different storage that we've talked about. To begin with, what happens when you create an EC2 machine? Well, you choose an AMI, a machine image, and you use that to launch your EC2 instance. At that point, your EC2 instance is created and all of the different configuration options are reserved for it, and it enters a pending state. Pending means it's basically building that image, copying things, acquiring resources, gathering everything together, and starting up that machine. Once the machine is started up, it enters a running state, and that's where your machines are going to spend most of their time. A machine inside of a running state can be rebooted, so obviously sometimes you need to reboot your computer. You can always reboot a machine, and it'll go from the rebooting state to the running state again. You can also terminate an EC2 instance, and terminating an instance is essentially deleting it. It's getting rid of it. It's telling it to go away, go bye-bye. The machine will shut down, cleanly shut down the operating system, and then it will terminate. And a terminated machine will actually be listed in your EC2 instances for a few minutes after it's been terminated, but eventually it will disappear. You won't see terminated machines any longer. Like I talked about before, when you terminate an instance, EBS-backed or instance-backed, that root volume is going to disappear. It's going to get deleted. But you can override for EBS-backed machines, you can override that delete option so that you don't delete the root volume on termination of those machines. And that means that the root volume will live in EBS. You'll pay for the storage that it takes up in EBS, but it will continue to live in EBS, and you can reattach it. You can use it on a new machine if you want to spin up a new machine with that volume. Now there's some additional work. Remember that I indicated an EBS-backed volume could be stopped while an instance-backed volume cannot be stopped. So this whole life cycle piece over here, I'm just going to draw a little circle around it, is EBS-backed only. So this is only available to EBS-backed volumes, and you can change a machine into a stop state, which eventually will, put it right here in the stop state, and that's where you can make those configuration changes that I talked about. From a stopped state, you can either restart it, get it running again, or you can terminate it, get rid of it entirely. So again, you see you get more flexibility and more options with EBS-backed instances. I really think for the most part you're going to use EBS-backed instances, but you will find use cases in your implementation possibly that would benefit from using the instance-backed machine. So that concludes this nugget on storage options for EC2 instances. Just to recap, we talked about the root volume configuration, which is specifically where is the root volume for our EC2 instance stored. It can either be instance-backed, which means that it's stored on a hard drive that's connected to the host machine that is hosting our virtual machine instance, or the more common EBS-backed, where the volume is stored in Elastic Block Store, Amazon's block storage in the cloud. We talked about the life cycle specifically of these instances and how when you terminate an instance, that root volume disappears, it's deleted, it evaporates into the cloud, unless you're using EBS-backed machines, in which case you can override that delete operation and tell it to persist that volume after the machine terminates. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.